On Perspective this week, we're hearing from the DEFA Minister about the Town and Country Planning Amendment Bill 2024, which, among other things, expands the definition of development, introduces a system of prior approvals and provides for the imposition of charges. The bill gets its final reading in LegCo next Tuesday, and the Minister has also recently introduced new protections for Manx bees and honey, and I'm sure you'll be buzzing with excitement to hear about that. Later in the programme, we'll hear from Rushen MHK Michelle Haywood on her private members' bill on safe access zones and protected public places. But first, DEFA Minister Claire Barber.
Well, they say every administration needs a planning bill, or at least a planning update. But there's a number of things that have come out of the Built Environment Reform Programme. So looking at how can we make the planning system more proportionate. So it's not about making it just easier to navigate, although we are doing some front-end work around the website, changing that, try to make that a little bit easier to access for people alongside, so there's a number of work streams, but also looking and making sure that we're not delaying things where it feels actually that's disproportionate to the situation. There are some amendments that look around the development procedure order work, which are Cabinet Office amendments, but we've folded them into this bill just for ease. And then also, I know we've talked before about some of the changes to DEFA applications, for example, and the appeals process. So there's a number of different areas it's covering. It's also laying the framework for some changes around registered buildings, and also the definitions of development, which then we'll be looking at through the permitted development. So although we at the minute are putting more things into the scope of development, the aim then would be to make sure really that's better understood to save time and queries, because at the minute that's taking quite a lot of officer time when people come in and say, well, is it development or isn't it? And then there needs to be a process that is undertaken to look at previous cases, to check that and understand it before we can then determine is an application needed or not. We're hoping that we can make things much clearer for applicants so that actually we save that time both for applicants themselves, which we know can be a frustration, but also for the planning officers, and free them up to ultimately determine more applications.
Does it help having two planning ministers? Because effectively you do the nuts and bolts element of planning, your department does, and then the Cabinet Office also has a role in setting planning policy. Does that lead to confusion, or is that a simpler system? I don't know. You explain it.
So I think, I can understand why and how it was framed that way, in that ultimately Cabinet Office Minister sits as the planning policy positioning, so the policy that we work against, so the strategic plan, for example, that's all coming through the planning policy section, and also the area plans, the area development plans. And we know we've obviously had work around the Eastern Area Plan that was in the last Parliament, and then we're currently going through the North and West Area planning process, which are big pieces of work, and those are then kept separately from the actual operational planning that sits in my department. I think, as you rightly point out, we then end up with a bit of a challenge sometimes, and we had initially ended up with two Town and Country Planning Act amendment bills, so quite quickly we decided it was actually far easier to work together and to make that into one piece of legislation, and then do our own pieces of work around the preparatory work, the drafting instructions, but to bring those together in terms of the actual piece of legislation. And actually that's worked really well, I think. I'm not saying that any system's perfect, because I think there's always scope for improvement, but I do think that I understand entirely why we want to keep the policy separate. But what I think is really important actually is that loop process of feeding back in. Certainly, for example, having Mr. Callister in the planning committee as the chair, the ability for the planning committee to feed back into planning policy, where, for example, there's something that just keeps coming up that feels like it doesn't quite seem right. And I see that as almost being the closed loop. Obviously, it's a new thing as well in this Parliament, where the planning committee member isn't in DEFA, and I've found that quite helpful, because I think it gives a perception potentially of conflict when those two roles sit together and co-locate. And actually I quite like the fact that Mr. Callister is in a position where he's independent from DEFA, and he can challenge, but he can also challenge into Cabinet Office, and it allows him that freedom to feed into both departments.
And of course the the marking your own homework element to all of this is a sound enough reason for removing or for separating planning policy from planning operation. But I guess that applies in lots of places across government, and I guess as well that there are times where you, by making this separation, you're doing it for good, sound, transparency purposes, but it then adds to the bureaucracy and the cost.
Well, certainly, I was a big advocate in my previous life, I suppose, as a backbencher, in terms of separating the policy from the regulation, and I think in this regard, planning, I suppose, is a regulatory function. So I still think that's right. I suppose in terms of how you look at cost savings, there are absolutely huge amounts of work that go on where both teams are involved, and we often will sit down if we've got a piece of work like this, and we'll sit down and work together on specific elements of it. But equally, we will robustly challenge each other if there's something that doesn't sit right about it. And I can assure you that when we bring a finished piece of legislation, as you know, and present that to the keys for consideration, it's very rare that everyone sat quietly behind the scenes and just nodded it through. There's been some quite loud arguments, both at department level, council of ministers level, in terms of getting things right, and that's absolutely been the case with this bill, as would be with any. There has been that challenge behind the scenes. There's been that pushback around consultation, taking comments on board. Which bits do we think we want to incorporate? Which bits do we think actually there's a valid point, but we probably save that for later? And which bits perhaps we just don't think do have a place in planning. So there's lots of conversation that goes on behind the scenes, but I'm certainly comfortable as things stand as to how that separation sits.
Your government has an ambition to grow the population. You've got an ambition to grow the economy. You want planning, I guess, to be responsive to that ambition and basically to make it easier for development to happen. Is that something you think that the public are completely on board with?
So I think there's a difference between making sure that the process is easier and there's not unnecessary delays, and just making it so that any old planning can get through, and that's absolutely not what we're trying to achieve. So we've really tried to strike the balance with this bill. I think it's the consultation would show that there's a number of developers who'd like us to have gone far further. Equally, it's fair to say that there are a number of people who I would put into the category that they would be more likely to object, whether that be an organisation or another group of people, where they perhaps are often commenting on applications, who might feel we've gone too far. As with everything, I suppose, when you've got equal noise on both sides, I think you've probably found yourself in about the right position. And ultimately, planning is there not to just give broad permission to everything, and not just to object to everything. We see planning very much as finding a framework that both protects what is absolutely so special about our island, but also allows us to make sure that we're protecting that island for the future and making it fit for purpose. So it absolutely is an area where, I think the first thing the officer said is, don't forget, in planning there's always a winner and a loser. You'll never just please everyone. And I think I take that on board completely. There's always someone who, for their particular situation, they feel that they've been, maybe failed is a strong word, but the planning system hasn't achieved what they wanted. And you see that in the appeals that come through to myself. Those appeals have very strong opinions from people on both sides, and trying to navigate that and understand how the inspector has traversed that narrative from both parties has been really insightful, actually, for me. But planning is definitely a balance, and I hope we've struck the right balance with this bill.
One of the elements to that balance, or certainly in relation to this bill, is you've extended the time now up to 10 years that a developer can get planning permission for a particular development and have to have started the work before the planning application fails. How does that help in terms of blots on the landscape, development sites that aren't being pursued? Although, judging by your expressions there. Perhaps I've misunderstood that.
Yeah, so absolutely, for normal planning applications, you do have to start within the same specified period as it's always been. It's not been increased to 10 years. And I would be very reluctant. We already know there are some challenges around people who start work, but the starting can be quite minimal, and that can cause frustration. So the thing that's changed from 5 years to 10 years, it's actually one of the changes that Cabinet Office brought forward, is specifically around the comprehensive treatment areas that are identified within the area development plans. So for example, in the Eastern Area Plan, there's a number of comprehensive treatment areas where a plan can be brought forward for a larger area. What was being found was that trying to get all of the consents and approvals that were needed within quite a big area sometimes just wasn't feasible within 5 years. They've extended that time frame to 10 years to hopefully allow for more progress.
Thanks for clearing that up, because I wasn't clear when I was reading the bill there. One of the other areas, and an area which has concerned some people who have an avid interest in planning and follow it closely, is the introduction of pre-application approvals. That almost feels like, the title feels like this is something, it's a behind closed door approval. So once it goes through the public process, it's almost guaranteed. I guess that's not how it's going to be, or?
No, and all of these things, again, are trying to almost formalise some of the work that's already happening, where we do a lot of pre-application work with individuals, ultimately with the goal of trying to get applications that do comply with the planning process. And that's, in the benefit of the wider public. But it's because in my opinion, it reduces fear and concern when a big application comes through, and, sometimes those things can be quite extraordinary. And of course, we may still get some of those. But equally, what it does is ensure that people aren't wasting a huge amount of time and resource, ultimately, in bringing applications that simply aren't going to work because they don't comply. So we would always encourage people anyway to come and talk to the planning team, look at when we give advice through the planning officers, that is done absolutely in good faith with the intention of trying to get an application that will comply with the strategic plan, with the development plans, but ultimately there is a decision that has to be taken, and there is always a balance of all of those elements, but the officers will guide as best they can around specific areas of planning. And actually I get feedback quite often about the quality of the pre-application advice that we give, and people feel that's a really helpful resource that's available to them. So it's something that I'm glad we're strengthening.
So is this limited to large developments, or can anybody, if I was wanting to, I don't know, build a garden shed or something, would I get pre-application advice?
So I think it's quite a broad piece. We get inquiries about all sorts of things. There may be some things where it's not appropriate, but the best thing to do is to get in touch directly with the planning officers, and they can guide you appropriately for the specific application that you're referring to. It would be fair to say that the bigger applications, there's more work in that regard, but equally the bigger applications are often in a fortunate position where they've been able to employ someone to support planning as well. So it can sometimes be the people who fall in the middle actually who need that most, people who aren't specifically employing the advice of a planner, but people who are a little bit more complex than something that perhaps is more straightforward.
So then to give some reassurance to people who see developers complaining loudly on social media, or to the press, of the Manx radio, wherever it may be, this is not effectively allowing them to subvent planning policy, just making it easier for them to ignore the law of the land when it comes to planning.
Absolutely not. In my view, the level of scrutiny applied to large applications is appropriate. That's why the amount of detail that's requested is high, is because these are big applications, and once they're built, they're going to be there for a long period of time. We want to make sure they're right, and they're right both in terms of the design fitting in with the local area and surroundings, but also in terms of the need and the strategic plan in terms of all those other things that need considering, such as parking, such as landscaping, such as public realm space, such as the agreements that would be made, such as Section 13, for example, as to what public housing might need to be provided or public resource in terms of that wider scheme. So all of those things are still in place, and absolutely they should be. What we're trying to do is, through both the legislative and non-legislative side, make the process easier to navigate and make sure we're getting to that end result in the easiest way possible. But those checks and balances are absolutely still in place.
The election of Donald Trump and now the first few weeks of his presidency demonstrates, I suspect, that there is an appetite for people to cut through red tape and bureaucracy. This bill certainly doesn't do that. I mean, even if you look across the water, the newly or relatively newly elected Labour government, their ambition seems much greater in terms of what they're saying about how they wish to reform planning. Is this just a kind of a trying to be all things up to all people sort of bill? Is it radical enough to ensure that you actually get your population growth and your growth in the economy, that development starts happening everywhere?
So I don't think it'd be radical enough for Donald Trump, and I'm delighted that's the case. I don't think that level of radical is what we want to see, and I think the consultation feedback for me shows that there is still people who are nervous about some of the changes we're making, but equally I do think we are making some changes. We're changing the rule around appeal, so at the minute when you get your application approved, you have to wait 21 days, even if the only person who actually has the right to appeal is yourself. Now, the reality is you're unlikely to appeal the decision if it was in your favour. So we're saying, actually, if it's only you can crack on straight away. That's just trying to make sure people can move quicker within the planning system. It's not negatively affecting anyone. We're also changing the appeals process to say, actually, the people who object need to have a proper reason for objection. And I think that's fair as well. Sometimes we did get things that felt a little bit like people just, putting a bit of a spanner in the works, but without anything material that was justifying that. And that caused a lot of frustration, not just for big developers, also for just people putting a small extension on their property. So we're just saying you can still object. Absolutely, the same people are retaining those rights of objection, but we think it's reasonable that early on you explain what the reason is for that objection. It also means the person, when they go away and they make any amends they want to for the appeal, can fix those problems. And if you don't know what they are, it's really tricky trying to navigate that. So I think we're absolutely trying to unpick some of those blockers, but we're trying to do it in a way that isn't as radical as Donald Trump, who I think would probably say, let's just get rid of the planning system and just see what happens. That's not where we're at, and I think when you go through our streetscapes, actually you can see that planning has worked. We have got lots of new development, but in the main it's fitting in and it works and it looks how it should. And that's the same as I think over years of development. I think we have probably got it about right, but actually in terms of bringing new residents and increasing the population to make sure we're filling those vacancies we already have, I think it's not just planning that will be the solution to that. We also know there's other work going on around vacant properties. How can we help in that regard and stimulate that? How can we make sure people aren't just sitting on properties that are dilapidated and ruinous? And we know the Housing Community Board are doing quite a lot of work. It may well be there are changes we need to make as a consequence of what they essentially decide to do, but at this point I feel these are the right changes for planning. And as I say, there's also non-legislative changes such as the planning website, which has always been somewhat tricky to navigate. We've just tried to make that a little bit easier. You don't have to download all the documents now, you can just view them online, which my memory on my computer is thrilled about, I can tell you. Changing the opening times off the back of a survey as well, so we're open for a little bit less time, but we're trying to make those times when people actually want to come and see us, but also the phone line is always available. So we are just trying to make things work a little bit easier, but equally if people have specific feedback, we're always welcome to hear that.
registered buildings, I mean, the legislation allows for buildings to be registered buildings of importance, historical importance, cultural importance. These can be registered, which then means that the owner of the building has a much more difficult job in terms of potentially saving the building, making it, providing a future use for it. There's no money, though, given to people who own registered buildings. There used to be. Is it fair to effectively slap all these protections on a building but not be prepared to give any support?
So we had obviously a long debate about this with Marlene Masker's committee on built heritage and how we preserve that. They came up with a large number of recommendations, and obviously there was some were supported, some weren't. I think we have to acknowledge that we are in a position where we don't have huge pots of money that we can throw in different areas, and we have to be quite circumspect, I think, about how we spend the money. The reality is that there aren't loads of registered buildings. There are some registered buildings, and we're certainly not registering them all over the place. So we do want to work with people in terms of registered buildings, and the registered buildings officers, absolutely keen to talk to people if they're looking to do work on registered buildings. And one of the interesting statistics actually that I got when we started to have this discussion in DEFA with the registered buildings team was actually it's not a case that it's really tricky to get permissions on registered buildings. There is a higher level of checking, absolutely, and I think that's right, and I think that's what the public would expect to preserve our registered buildings. But what absolutely is the case is that when you work with the team is they will look for solutions. How can that be achieved? And actually the vast majority of those applications are approved, and that's following that work with the registered buildings officer, who might say, do you know what, understand what you're trying to achieve, but you might want to look at this material instead of this material just to make sure it's in keeping with the building. And I think that, again, is reasonable. And let's not forget, a number of these are in government ownership, and it's absolutely right that we are looking at how we manage those registered buildings to preserve them for the future. One of the other things, though, we are doing in this legislation is trying to take a more proportionate approach to conservation areas. So at the minute it's a very broad brush across conservation areas, whereas actually we recognise that sometimes it's not the whole area, and the same with registered buildings. So we're trying to provide some ability to carve out what it is particularly that we're trying to preserve, to make that also a little bit easier in some terms. So some of that will come through the regulations that follow, but we are certainly alive to that piece of work, in that when we have a conservation area, taking the promenade for example, sitting in my constituency, what we're really preserving or wanting to preserve is the frontage of those buildings, that really striking visual frontage. But at the minute, if you want to replace the windows in the back, in the streets at the back that aren't really notable, you would have to go through the same process as you would for the ones at the front, and that doesn't feel proportionate. So we are looking at how can we make that work a little better, and the same with registered buildings, where it may be that the frontage of a building is particularly unique, the way that the roofs are built, for example, the structure, but it may be that there's a small element of that building that's been added on at a later stage that actually doesn't need to be registered. So the ability to delineate what it exactly is that we're trying to protect, and allow that little bit of latitude for those owners, that they don't have to worry so much for those bits that don't fall in that part.
So I guess the answer to is it fair is we're making it less onerous for owners of registered buildings in terms of what they must do, and you're basically saying because we haven't got any money, we're not going to support them.
I think if I was in an ideal world, we absolutely would love to be able to provide that, and I think that was exactly what was said in the debate. I think the reality is we're not in that position, and I think we have to be realistic. But there are some pieces of work that we've gone away with that we will report back on in that regard in response to the committee. So I think what we're doing is looking at what can we do within the resources we currently have available to make that situation a little easier, while we don't have the money to just provide grants. And of course, we also have to accept, and I know we talked about this in the debate, if someone said we could just do a nominal grant, £5,000, when you look at the amount of money that some people are spending on registered buildings, it's so small as to not really acknowledge the scale of what might be needed. So I think it would almost be a disservice to just throw something at it and say, well, we've done something. I just don't think that's probably the right solution. So I think looking at ways we can make things easier within the current framework is something that we can do without costing the taxpayer money, but while hoping to achieve something that makes life a little easier for those people who've taken on that role of protecting our built heritage.
Loads of other questions I think I could have asked about planning, but the other thing that we invited you here to talk about is new legislation to boost protection for Manx bees and biodiversity, which is a catchy title. What's so special about Manx bees?
So our bees are particularly special because they are free from a number of different diseases. Varroa mites, the main one I think that we hear a lot about, but there's also the small beehive beetle and foul brood. Those statuses are because of the significant work of our beekeepers over many years, and are things that we absolutely want to maintain. And one of the biggest risks is bringing new bees in and bringing in used beehives, and because of our status, those are things that we don't want to do. We were in a position where the legislation that was in place, there was some questioning about its efficacy because of the legislation that it sat under, and we felt it was right to regularise that situation and to bring in legislation that made it absolutely explicit our position. And we've also produced guidance that goes alongside that just to make that a little easier to understand.
And in terms of the impact, I mean, assuming you were a beekeeper who was starting up, presumably you have to then go to another Manx beekeeper to get any bees to start your first hive with. If you were in the UK or indeed anywhere in Europe, you could just ask, you buy in bees from people who produce bees for sale. That obviously makes it more onerous for Manx beekeepers, particularly those starting up. So
I suppose, yes, technically, but my understanding from talking to the beekeepers is this is how they've been operating for many years, and actually the value of our bees because of that is actually just significantly greater. And I don't necessarily mean a financial value, but it's the value to us as a society, and the ability to have our Manx honey and protect it, and of course not to lose colonies of bees because of disease. So this is something that the beekeepers have wanted for some time, and there has been an assumption that is in place. I know I've been talking to some beekeepers recently about perhaps other things we can change in terms of the regulations, and there's certainly things that we're happy to explore, but this was very specifically making sure that our current position was protected in regard to our bees, and making sure that we didn't inadvertently have a situation where someone might in good faith import either bees or used beekeeping equipment and inadvertently introduce something that our colony would be absolutely vulnerable to, and we would see our Manx bees decimated in that situation. And that's certainly something we want to avoid at all costs.
Because Varroa, of course, can wipe out colonies of bees, and presumably it would be relatively quickly spread around the island if it did get here.
That's certainly my understanding, and we want to avoid that. So it's been a little bit of time just making sure we get things where they need to be, and as I say, we have produced that guidance just to make sure that it is easier for someone going into the beekeeping world, and for people who've already got established colonies, but we want to make sure we protect what we already have, which is thanks to the beekeepers, an excellent quality of Manx bee that doesn't have those various diseases present, and means that we can carry on enjoying the Manx honey, which certainly in my opinion is better than any I've had anywhere else.
So protection of Manx bees is one thing. Making sure that what we actually are buying in the shops is Manx honey is another. We did have, and this is it sounds a little ridiculous, but we did have an example of honey laundering when I was minister in DEFA about 10 years or more ago now. Is that still a thing where large companies or large honey production areas from I think in this case it was somewhere in the Far East had been trying to use the Isle of Man to clean their honey, so to speak?
So I'm not aware that specifically is an issue, but we have been in correspondence with a number of people recently around labelling. And in fact, there was a written question from the Speaker just a few weeks ago on this. And the specific problem is that we know that there are people retailing into larger retailers, imported honeys that are called, and I call them honeys, it's with very clear inverted commas. They're labelled as honey. It looks how we expect honey to look, but the reality is that it isn't honey, and it's very heavily modified, sometimes actually having no honey. And I've seen someone shared an article with me from, I can't remember the country now off the top of my head, but somewhere in sort of Eastern Europe, neck of the woods, if I recall correctly, where they've just done a big piece of work around this and labelling. So we've made a commitment with the beekeepers actually that we would be happy to explore labelling opportunities to really give that provenance of Manx honey, to give the consumer the ability to make a conscious call, because their challenge at the minute, of course, is the price point for something that is actually honey is higher than for something that is able to call itself honey but clearly is not honey, and it's allowing the consumer to make an informed decision about what they're looking to purchase. And I think that's really important. So if we can support as DEFA in any way, we would like to definitely step into that space. So we've given that commitment both in the written answer to Mr. Speaker but also in conversation with the beekeepers. That's something we'll be picking up.
So I guess were there such an organisation as Honeyval, the Isle of Man would get a pass with flying colours. Any international honey bodies coming in and reviewing the Isle of Man? Well,
I suppose if Honeyval turn up and are looking at our Manx honey, I think we're in an excellent place. The question mark, as I say, is over how the labelling of honey more generally is managed. And I think, I understand the frustration that you can spend a huge amount of time and effort making sure you've got an exceptional local Manx product with the bees being protected, all of the positive things that our beekeepers are doing, and then have to put it on the shelf next to something that, is some form of sugar supplemented syrup, but is able to use the same name, not the Manx element, but the honey name. I can understand the frustration. So I think if we can do something around labelling our Manx honey and providing that absolute confidence in that, I hope that would go some way to appeasing any future Honeyval inspections.
That was Douglas East MHK and DEFA Minister Claire Barber. Rushen MHK Michelle Haywood has a private members' bill to introduce safe access zones and protected public places. Why has she brought this forward?
It was really driven from seeing what the protections were in the abortion reform bill act now that came through for people accessing services, and with a kind of growing awareness of how people accessing health services, social care services, and also those engaged in medical and scientific research around the island were being impacted by protesters and people willing to interfere with what they were doing when what they're doing is perfectly lawful and legal. And the realisation that it was almost an extension of what was in the abortion reform bill to take those clauses and that protection and to apply it to other circumstances if necessary. And I think that's the thing to stress, is that this is not a blanket, nobody's allowed to protest anywhere. This allows the department to deal with very specific areas of concern when problems have arisen.
Is there much call for this at the moment? I mean, are there plentiful examples of problems that the problem that this bill is aimed to prevent actually occurring on the island?
I think there is. I think there's been well publicised attempts to influence children who are having vaccines delivered through schools, and this bill would allow us to designate the school as a safe zone for a period of time to allow children to go to school without being accosted by people trying to peddle misinformation to them and trying to persuade them of a course of action. I'm also conscious, having spoken to a couple of the sort of scientific research facilities that are here on island, that their staff have been intimidated in car parks, and it's not at the level that meets the harassment definition within law. It's not persistent, it's not targeted at the same person, it's just a general, we're going to target it at anyone coming to the building. And I myself, visiting some of these buildings, have been targeted too, and no idea what I was doing there or what I was accessing. So it's really about saying that there is a place for protest, but the place for protest is with the people who make the law, and that's fine. But what you shouldn't be doing is trying to intimidate or manipulate somebody else's behaviour. If what they're doing is lawful, if the doctors recommended that that's what they go and do, and all of that, you shouldn't be interfering with that.
But surely, if it's not harassment, if it's not an existing criminal offence, then that should be okay.
No, it's just because it doesn't meet the threshold for harassment, because it's not necessarily targeted at the same person in the same way. And so we know with cases that I'm aware of that it just hasn't reached that threshold for prosecution. But that doesn't mean that it won't dissuade people from accessing services that they should be accessing. And I did have a gentleman who wrote to me and said, but if I want to stand and silently pray outside of an abortion facility, then I should be entitled to do that. It's not intimidating, but it is the very presence of the fact that you're there intimidates. And if you're going to pray, I'm pretty sure that you can pray to whichever God you want, wherever you are. It doesn't have to be in the vicinity of somebody who you happen to disagree with. So it's really about safeguarding those people accessing services.
But then again, a protest, if it's to be worth anything, it has to be in the vicinity of people who you are protesting against, surely.
I don't think anyone should be protesting against the service users. If you want to protest about a service, then you protest to the people who made the decision. So if you want to protest about vaccinations, for example, then you go and protest to Manx Care, because they're the people who make the decisions about what vaccinations are offered. Or you go and protest to the Department of Health and Social Care. You don't protest to school children, to be fair. It's just not acceptable.
Is there not an existing offence that would deal with that sort of thing?
No, and particularly in the case of the scientific company that I was at, there's nothing. If you're on a public footpath, you could stand there and shout whatever you liked, because you're shouting generally, and so it's not targeted enough to meet that threshold. But I do know that particular facility struggled to recruit staff because of every day when you get out of your car, you weren't sure what was going to face you, and that level of harassment and intimidation is just not acceptable. It just doesn't meet the current thresholds in the law.
So who specifically can be covered by this, or who and what? Because it's premises and people, isn't it?
Yeah, it's mainly set around a location. So it can be a location where any number of possible services, and it's deliberately written so it's widely spec'd. And so either it could be a government-owned facility, or it could be a private company who would have to put in a request to say, this is the problem that we are experiencing, and this is the zone that we'd like to protect as a consequence. So anyone who is approaching that zone could would be covered by the requirements around it. But it's very case specific as to, so it's not defined on a certain area, it's not defined on a certain radius from any point. It's designed to be flexible for the location.
The bill, though, does appear to give a lot of ability to the department to make certain pronouncements and impose certain standards on people in relation to safe access zones and protected public places. The where are the checks and balances here? So if someone fundamentally disagrees with this, is there any appeal process in the bill?
So the order itself can be made by the department and can be implemented straight away in response to an emerging threat to that facility or to the users or to the staff. The order then has to come in front of Tynwald, so there's a check at that point. People can obviously make representations to their MH or any of the MHKs or members of Tynwald around that, and the order can be challenged at that point. So there are checks and balances, and it's not a carte blanche just to, it's quite prescribed in the Act as to what information is needed in order to enable the department to make a decision. So it's not a sweeping power necessarily. The public safety protection part of the bill, which would rest with the Department of Home Affairs, is actually modelled on legislation that's available to local authorities in the UK, that they can designate, and they have to meet certain criteria, that it has to be an ongoing disruption to residents in the area, and so it couldn't just be a one-off protest that you'd ban. It'd have to be something that was ongoing and detrimental to the quality of life in an area. So there's thresholds around where that can be applied as well. So I think there are a reasonable number of safeguards in there.
This is limited to physical space, though, isn't it? It's not, it's not the virtual community on the internet or anything like that.
Oh no, it's limited to physical space, and it really is about being able to turn up for an appointment, a facility, and know that you can get off the bus or get out of your car or whatever, and you can walk in there unhindered. And patients who are accessing appointments are very often far more vulnerable than they would be if they were just going shopping or whatever, because they're obviously sometimes in a position where they've made a difficult decision about whether to have treatment or not. And I feel that the psychological stress of having people kind of trying to change your mind about what you're doing, it's just unwarranted.
The bill also does talk about protected people. So the protected people presumably are the patients visiting different services, or does it include workers within those facilities? So
no, it's the patients or people using the services. It's anyone accompanying them as well, and then it's the staff providing them. And so that was really, it's the same as within the abortion Act protections, you don't have you don't create any gaps in who's protected by it. So if somebody is going to protest outside, and it's been suggested this could be applied to assisted dying, and it could if that was if that was what was needed. But if you can imagine that if you're the patient who's decided that that's the right route for you, and you're turning up with your relatives to a facility or a clinic or whatever it is, while you're making those very difficult decisions, neither you nor the staff nor your friends and relatives that are accompanying you should be subject to any sort of protest. And I really do think that the place for protest is with the people who make the rules and regulations. It is not trying to target service users.
I kind of understand where you're coming from in relation to that. It's not quite harassment, but it's close. It's more difficult, for me anyway, to understand why silent protest, things like if someone living next door to a facility that they fundamentally disapprove of can't put a poster in their window to say, actually, I fundamentally disapprove of this facility. Explain a bit about the thinking behind that.
So we know that intimidation, the law as it defines intimidation currently is quite restrictive. But intimidation comes in many forms. It's not somebody leering over you, shouting in your face necessarily. It can be done by a variety of methods. And I think on a different scale entirely, I can hark back to when I was going through the election, and there were some posters about politicians and people who wanted to be politicians that appeared, and I even found that intimidating, because you're getting criticism from people you don't know, who don't know you, don't know your motives, and don't understand your situation or your take on things. But it's that that feeling of, well, I don't think I can go in there because I've seen what this is. And for somebody turning up, say for services related to their sexual health or whatever, if they're already stressed and they start seeing even those little signals, that can have really, really big effect on whether they're accessing services that they need.
Is this a kind of a sad reflection, perhaps, of the society that we now live in, that things have changed so much that people do feel that level of intimidation? Or is this a thing that has been there for a very, very long time, that perhaps this level of intimidation or that people feel in relation to use of certain services, that's existed? It's just no one's really recognised it or felt it important to protect people in those circumstances.
I think there's been... I lived for a while in Ealing, West London, which was the first place to put in a protected zone around a Mary Stopes clinic there. And that was... I used to walk past there, and even as somebody not accessing the services, it felt awful. And I felt incredibly sorry for the women that were having to walk past posters and people praying for them and all sorts of things at a very difficult time. So I think perhaps some of this has always been there, but I think what we've seen latterly is a growing sense of entitlement, that people feel that they are entitled in some way to tell other people what they should be doing or what they shouldn't be doing, or what decisions they should make about their own health and their own access to services. And I think this is my pushback against that, is that I don't feel that you're entitled to tell it. You're entitled to have your opinion. You're not necessarily entitled to share it with some people because it's not relevant. And so, I do think this is a pushback, and I think we see increasingly, and social media is becoming even worse for this. You see a sense of people wanting to tell you just how wrong you are, with no evidence and no discussion about it, but they'll leap straight into attack. And I'm seeing that as an increasing threat to people who are just getting on with their normal lives. Could
this be a kind of, or seen anyway, as a thin end of a wedge? I mean, having been in your role as DOI Minister twice in the past, it can be quite an intimidating environment to work. There's an awful lot of abuse that staff have to take. Your bill, I think, is limited to health-related matters, but if once this is introduced, could someone not say, well, actually, I feel intimidated in my workplace. Maybe there needs to be similar legislation for me.
We already have codes of conduct and things, and we already have a very strong policy on how staff should be spoken to, and clear statements up at all our public counters about, we won't tolerate that sort of behaviour. So I largely think that's covered, although I know that the DOI staff particularly come in under a huge pressure from the public for everything we do or don't do. Everyone's got a comment to make about it, and we're always in the wrong. I think I've been called feckless and helpless this week. I'm going for reckless as well. That people feel the need that they can throw out insults left, right, and centre. It probably is becoming a problem. And I know I've got staff that are leaving the service of the DOI because of how they're treated by the public, and I genuinely don't understand what gives people the right to do it. In this case, it is very specifically around people who, it's health and social care services. They are vulnerable people. They're more vulnerable than officers. We can do lots of support for our officers within government departments. But when you're trying to access a service and you're under some stress anyway, that's the time I think we really do need to step in and have legislation that protects them.
There are people who have dissected the bill and suggest that effectively you're going to be allowed to do a whole load of things here. You can designate safe zones without giving any particular reason to the public. Bearing in mind the effectively what you're doing is you're removing people's ability to protest in what would normally be reasonable circumstances. Do you think that there's too much power going into the hands of government? Perhaps there needs to be some level of independent scrutiny of this.
I think because of the way it's set up in terms of the department having to make an evaluation first and to be satisfied that the criteria have been met, I'm happy with that level of scrutiny over it. The fact that it then comes to Tynwald is that check and balance on it. The ability to make the orders and to make them available immediately, I think, allows you to respond to developing situations and not sit there and watch a situation deteriorate so that people are feeling intimidated and upset and harassed, that somebody has been videoing them and broadcasting it on social media, and all of those harms have already been caused, because you can respond much more quickly than you would otherwise. And we spent a long time, when I was sort of like sat with the drafters, working out exactly what order did you need to be able to do it, and the imperative in some of these cases will be to act as quickly as possible, and that's why it's framed the way it is.
Rushen MHK Michelle Haywood. So what do you think? Should we be protected from people who wish to lobby against our use of certain buildings and services? Is the new planning bill a much needed change to allow developers more freedom to get on and build? I'm Phil Gorn. Guramaeus and Geisach Rum. Thanks for listening.